Welcome. In this short video, we're going to talk about comparative advantage and how it applies to international trade. We'll explain why it drives the gains from trade, and we'll look at an example, a very simple example illustrating the gains from trade that can happen when nations specialize in their comparative advantage. So why trade? Well, the idea here is mutually beneficial exchange. When both parties voluntarily agree to an exchange, we have to believe it's because both parties are better off. And both nations can gain from trade. By gain from trade, we're really saying that nations can consume beyond their own production possibilities. So a nation's consumption possibilities can exceed its production possibilities. So let's think about why this works. The idea behind comparative advantage is that one country produces a good at a lower opportunity cost than another country. Now, not necessarily more efficiently. In other words, a country could be more efficient in the production of many goods, but it still pays for that country to trade and specialize in what they're absolutely best at. Now, a reminder that opportunity cost refers to goods that are given up in order to produce the other goods here. So when you're producing a good at a lower opportunity cost, it means that you're not giving up as much as other countries do in order to produce that good. This is easier to see with an example. So let's just do a simple example, completely hypothetical. Two countries, the United States and Belgium, two goods, sweaters and waffles. And let's think of a production possibilities that tells us how much can be produced per labor hour. And given technologies and resources is constant, we'll get a production possibilities. So I'm going to graph the production possibilities for each country. So here I have the United States, and so you can see if we produce 0 waffles, 1 labor hour totally devoted to sweaters, we have 100 sweaters, and so forth. We start to produce more waffles with our labor hour, we can produce fewer and fewer sweaters. To make things simple, I actually see there's a constant ratio for the trade-off between sweaters and waffles in the United States here. Every 100 waffles costs 25 sweaters in terms of production. So in other words, the opportunity cost of 1 sweater is in fact 4 waffles. Now let's go on to Belgium. And so in Belgium again I have the same two goods, sweaters and waffles, and I'm looking at 1 labor hour. So notice here, if they totally devote in Belgium that labor hour to sweaters, they make 40. At the other extreme, if it's totally devoted to waffles, they'll make 320 in that hour. But what we see is every time we increase waffle production by 80 waffles, it's going to cost us 10 sweaters because we're reallocating that labor hour. So that ratio reduces to an opportunity cost of 8 waffles in order to produce 1 additional sweater. So if we look at these two tables, we actually see United States has an absolute advantage in sweaters and waffles. This is a hypothetical example. I have no idea if this is true. But here in this table, as we've drawn it, the United States can produce more sweaters per labor hour, 100 versus 40. And the United States can produce more waffles per labor hour, 400 versus 320. That's an absolute advantage. Nonetheless, it's important to note the U.S. still can gain if they trade with Belgium. Just because they're more efficient in the production of sweaters and waffles with that labor hour, that absolute advantage is not what's going to drive the gains from trade. So the U.S. has an absolute advantage in both goods, but there's still gains from trading. And to understand why, we need to focus back on that comparative advantage. The comparative advantage, the United States gives up fewer waffles to make 1 sweater. Remember, comparative advantage is about opportunity cost. The opportunity cost of 1 sweater is 4 waffles in the United States. It's twice as much. It's 8 waffles in Belgium. So in other words, the United States has a comparative advantage in sweaters. In terms of the amount of waffles you have to give up, the U.S. produces a sweater more cheaply than Belgium. So this is comparative advantage. We're comparing two. So if the U.S. has a comparative advantage in sweaters, Belgium must have the comparative advantage in waffles. Belgium waffles. Haha, you must have known that was coming, right? So, given this comparative and absolute advantage state in this example, let's think about if there's no trade, and then it gives us the comparison case for specialization in trade. So if there's no trade, which is referred to as autarky, and so in other words, in autarky, your consumption as a nation is going to be equal to what you produce because you're not trading for anything. So here's the United States production possibility curve, or frontier here. It's a straight line in this case because I made a simple constant trade-off between waffles and sweaters. All right, and so I simply plotted the points from the production possibility table earlier, right? 100 sweaters if we make no waffles, 400 waffles if we make absolutely no sweaters, and then in between. And of course, this shaded area, this triangle here under this line, that's actually where they can consume. So the United States, it's possible in autarky to consume anywhere in this triangle, on this line or anywhere underneath in the triangle. That's their choice set. Now let's flip over to Belgium. Again, still sweaters and waffles, and again I'm just plotting that production possibility curve. If they produce no waffles, they're capable of making 40 sweaters with the labor hour, and if they produce only waffles, they make 320, and we draw the line. Again, the possibilities for consumption are equal to what they can actually produce. So any point here in this triangle is the consumption possibilities here for Belgium, if there's no trade. So, given that's the state in autarky, now we can compare with international trade. So suppose they both are going to specialize in their comparative advantage good. So that's sweaters for the United States and it's waffles for Belgium. And then they'll trade for the other good. So let's put some terms of trade here. So the U.S. is going to specialize in sweaters, and they'll trade 40 sweaters for 240 waffles. Belgium will specialize in the production of waffles, and they will trade 240 waffles for 40 sweaters. And we'll see these terms of trade here are something they would both agree to, because as we're going to see, it makes them better off than if they didn't trade at all. So, given that's the terms of trade, let's see what's going to happen here. So the United States is specializing in sweaters. So they can make 100 sweaters per labor hour, 0 waffles. So if they actually trade at this rate of trade up here in the top, they're left with 60 sweaters and the 240 waffles they get in the trade. Belgium's going to specialize in waffles. So they make 0 sweaters, 320 waffles. Once they make this trade, they'll have 40 sweaters, and they give away 240 waffles to the U.S. in that trade, so they'll have 80 waffles left per labor hour. So now let's plot this consumption point relative to their production possibilities. All right. So we go back to the United States production possibility curve. That's the consumption point. Now we're going to plot the point of 60 sweaters and 240 waffles. And when we do, 60 sweaters is about right here, 240 is about right here. Notice the United States, by trading, by specializing in what it does relatively best compared to Belgium, and then trading for the other product they want, they reach a consumption point that is beyond what they could do if they were on themselves. That's the gains from trade. They reach a point that wouldn't be possible if they weren't trading at all. It's going to be the same for Belgium. Again, under the ratio we set up, they're over here. They get 40 sweaters, and they're left with 80 waffles. And as you can see, it's a point beyond the production possibility curve. Trade allows countries to consume beyond what they could just produce on their own if they were doing everything themselves. Why? Because we're specializing. We're specializing in what we do best and then trading for the other things. So that specialization in the good with the lowest opportunity cost really kind of maximizes global production that can be shared among countries. Now that asks the question, well, what drives the specialization for a country? How do you decide? What determines whether there's comparative advantage in sweaters or waffles or other products? Well, there's a few reasons. There's a few factors that are going to drive the specialization when we look at world trade. One is a different resource endowment. Climate, farmland, natural resources, right? A country can't specialize in natural gas production if they don't have natural gas deposits. That really wouldn't make any sense. Extreme. Climate and farmland. The United States produces very little coffee, even though we drink quite a bit of it. Our climate and farmland in most of the United States is not well suited for growing coffee, so we trade for it. Economies of scale also determine specialization in trade. Some goods are produced a lot more cheaply on a large scale, and because of that, it makes sense if one country is going to specialize, produce a product on a large scale, and then sell it to the rest of the world. Finally, a difference in taste can also drive it. Countries have different consumption patterns, which affects the export-import pattern. For example, the U.S. produces a lot of chicken domestically. We don't really keep the chicken feet. We export most of our chicken feet, for example, to China right now. And that has to deal with taste and preferences and body parts. Chicken feet aren't really a popular ingredient in the United States. They're used a lot more in China, hence this pattern of trade. Tea in the United Kingdom, coffee in the United States. This has to deal with the difference of taste and preferences.